Today's presentation is the Agile PMO from Process Police to Adaptive Governance, presented by Sanjeev Augustine. Today we'll go over how to scale Agile methods beyond individual projects and how PMOs can avoid being process police instead of truly supporting Scrum teams. Sanjeev will share principles and techniques for an Agile PMO and discuss how those concepts are being applied in the industry to scale Scrum through adaptive governance of programs and portfolios. Sanjeev Augustine is president of Lightspeed and is an industry-leading Agile and Lean expert. He is a co-founder and board member of the Agile Project Leadership Network. He is also the author of several publications, including the book Managing Agile Projects, and is the founder and moderator of the Yahoo Agile Project Management Discussion Group. As an in-the-trenches practitioner, he has personally managed Agile projects varying in size from 5 to over 100 people and coached numerous project teams. For more information about Sanjeev, you can also go to his website at sanjeevaugustine.com. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sanjeev.
Thanks, Leanne, and welcome everybody to this webinar where we'll be talking about a really value-added role for the PMO, specifically how to set up an Agile PMO and move from a perception of the PMO as perhaps as process police to more what we call adaptive governance. The agenda for our talk today is I'll be introducing some notions about why we need an Agile PMO. There are some in the industry and some in the Agile community who believe that PMOs are no longer necessary or no longer adding value to our organization. And I'll be presenting some thoughts onto why I think they, if set up right, they can play an enormously and significantly value-added role. We'll be talking about some specifics about setting up the Agile PMO in terms of a philosophy and an organizational structure and what they need to shoot for. And then specifically, we'll be talking about scaling Agile methods like Scrum through what we call adaptive governance with 4 practices relating to project prioritization and selection, for tracking the portfolio, managing resources, and then sustaining Agile adoption beyond individual projects. So just a word about adaptive governance. If you are practicing Agile methods in any significant capacity, meaning that if you have at least 1 or 2 projects going for more than 6 months, you've more than likely encountered a few challenges, but you've also encountered some of the successes that Agile methods can bring. So you probably have some early delivery of value into production. You have some satisfied product owners that you're working with. These are the business representatives of your projects. And more than likely, you have team members who are re-energized and revitalized by the innovation and collaboration and the satisfaction that working on an Agile team can bring. Also, if you've had the success at the project level, you're now looking at scaling Agile to a larger group, perhaps an organization group level scaling, or perhaps just a department-wide scaling. There are certain things that start to rain on that parade, if you will. Things that they might be organizational structures that impinge on any advancement of Agile beyond individual projects. And so we'll be talking about a role for the PMO to really help at the program and portfolio level. We'll have, as Leanne mentioned, about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. And I'd welcome any questions at the end where we can answer anything that we might come up during the course of this talk. So why do we need an Agile PMO? If you look at the sidebar on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a little blurb from March 2009 from the Project Management Journal, which is a publication of the PMI, the Project Management Institute. And the blurb suggests that it's an excerpt from this article by Hurt and Thomas relating to PMOs, and it suggests that the role of the PMO, or the value-adding role of the PMO, is sort of being called into question. And Hurt and Thomas believe that it's somewhat ambiguous as to the tenuous nature of the position of PMOs in the organization. I guess in straightforward English, it means that people are looking at the PMO and asking, are these folks really adding value? Now that's a little sad, because if you look at the typical course of how PMO is set up, we take our best and brightest project managers, people who've been excelling in delivery on projects, and we say, we need these folks to deal with sticky problems beyond individual projects, and we tend to congregate them in this organization called PMO. and to a certain extent, we hamper them and we almost isolate them from being able to deliver value. So what are some of the problems they face? If you look at some of the lists over here, I mean, I don't want to read the entire slide, but there's a lack of authority over the actual execution of PMO initiatives. There's perhaps a lack of executive support. Executive managers, executive VPs and presidents are probably more interested in getting reports and standard, status reports and progress tracking from the PMO, and then they are actually interested in getting the PMO involved in delivering value and helping teams. There's also seems to be an over-reliance on PPM, project portfolio management tools. Whenever we have a sticky problem, there's a tendency in our organizations to go out and buy the coolest or the latest or the heaviest tool available. And a lot of times when we bring in a PPM tool, we're not looking at the process first and really looking at what problems we need to solve. I'm a big believer in using tools when they apply, and I believe they can add value whether it's at the project level or the portfolio level. But before we go run out and buy a tool, we have to sort of examine the problem and see what we want to achieve, and then look for a tool that actually supports it. Speaking of tools and techniques, there seems to be a misalignment between the tools and the techniques and reporting at the project level and at the larger organization level. So what do I mean by this? If you're producing some burn down charts, some velocity charts, some graphs like that at the project level, your teams are excited by that. Your scrum masters find them useful. The product owners can relate to them. But as you move up the chain, executives are probably more used to seeing some red, yellow, green kind of status reporting, some perhaps a balanced scorecard type of reporting, and there's not a clean alignment or a clean way to translate the tremendous value that Agile projects are delivering to the executives. We need to find a way where PMOs can help out with that. Also, if you refer back to the sidebar, there's a little statistic that says 53% of CIOs believe that their IT project prioritization is politically driven. Now, I, for one, think this number is pretty low. Most project prioritization is fraught with politics, and it seems like most organizations don't have a good way of putting in place a rigorous project prioritization discipline. So we'll talk very shortly about how PMOs will be able to help with that. The first thing we need to take a look at is how we go about setting up the Agile PMO. There are two visions for the PMO, and one of them comes from the PMI through the PIN box, and the other one comes via the APLN, the Agile Project Leadership Network, and is captured.
Hey, Sanjeev.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but could you speak a little louder or turn up the volume on your phone? We're having a couple people requesting that they are having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, sure. Is that better?
I will wait on getting some feedback and see if people can hear you a little better. That should be, just keep going, sorry.
Okay, all right. So we're talking about two visions for the PMO. How can we blend the PMBOK, the PMI vision with something that's come out of the Agile community, the Declaration of Interdependence and the APLN? The PMBOK says, the third edition of the PMBOK guide says, the PMO is an organizational unit to centralize and coordinate the management of projects under its domain. And the APLN then has a slightly different vision that envisions that people, project leaders who are contributing value should be focusing on things like increasing return on investment, delivering reliable results, and so on until we improve effectiveness and reliability. And you can check the Declaration of Interdependence out at pmdoi.org. I see these two visions for the PMO as very complementary. We need an organizational unit to centralize and coordinate the management. We also need to avoid the heavy top-down command and control type of structure, and we can do that by drawing on the Declaration of Interdependence as our inspiration. Okay, so specifically, what are some of the things we can do? There's a structure that you see on your screen over here on slide number 7, and we've seen this work with some of the industry leaders who are adopting Agile at the enterprise and program portfolio level that we've been working with. and it's a structure that seems to work really well. At the bottom level, you see the project teams. These are the ones in your shaded yellow, and you see these three things at the bottom of the organizational triangle structure, if you will. And then the level above that is this lean agile PMO or an agile PMO. And this is the virtual team, mostly in virtual team. What do I mean by that? Basically, we mean that the members of the PMO are both selected and elected. There are some selected members of the PMO. These folks are selected by management, maybe some top, some vice president, a line executive, maybe a line program manager selected to sit on the PMO. And then the other part of the team really comes from below, from the project teams themselves. Project teams get to elect members to sit on the PMO. And this ensures that we have an overlapping between these two levels of management. Now, the project teams might select a scrum master at some parts of the project. They might say, as they're getting closer to release, they might choose an architect or a technical lead, somebody who can represent the technical problems as you get closer to delivery. So that also implies that the membership of this partially virtual team is somewhat is temporary and transient. So it's not an ivory tower organization that sits outside the execution line, if you will, of the projects themselves, and it's not a completely a top-down, imposing organization. So we ensure that by having overlap between the two levels, and we also ensure that by making sure that there's transient membership and more folks are going back to their teams and contributing value to the team. The other part of it, as we move up the structure, there's an overlap between the PMO and the steering committee. So again, we could ensure that what the PMO is doing is linking back to organizational strategy and execution by having an elected member from the PMO sit on a steering committee. And likewise, in the opposite direction, we can make sure that there's a selected member from the steering committee who's sitting on the Lean Agile PMO. Now, it turns out, if you look at the sidebar, it turns out that a centralized structure like this is really good for discovery. It's good for pollinating the things that come up in the project team. It's good for taking the results, the innovation, the creative stuff that happens at the ground level on the project team and ensuring that it is disseminated to the rest of the organization. So it's a way of making sure that the higher level management knows and is plugged into what's happening at the project team level. It also is a way of making sure that the project teams are getting the top-down vision, the centralized, the executive vision, the corporate vision, and making sure that they can align really well with that. The other key point to note here is on the last bullet. We say that the Agile PMO should be run as an Agile project team. What are the advantages, and what do we mean by this, and what are some of the advantages? We mean that the PMO should have a backlog. It should have a backlog of projects that is queuing up and helping to manage demand. And it should also have a backlog of key organizational change objectives, of initiatives that it needs to execute against. So if there are cross-project items, if there are program-level things, if there are portfolio management things, we put them in the backlog, and we get a PMO-level product owner, an executive, someone who can make decisions and stand in for management and is empowered to make decisions on behalf of management on the portfolio prioritization. The other thing we make sure is that the PMO is running in sprints and delivering in time boxes and gets to understand some of the modus operandi of how a Scrum or an Agile team runs. They get to do backlogs, they get to do stand-ups, perhaps not daily stand-ups, but maybe weekly stand-up meetings or a stand-up meeting every couple of days. But they get a taste of what it means to be an Agile team as well. We don't leave them out of the party for that. Also, we need to make sure that they have some principles to execute it. What are some higher level philosophy? What are some things to look to guide the operation of an Agile project management office? Some of the best guidelines come from Lean. As we know, we look at Agile as a form of Lean software development, and some of the Lean principles really deliver a tremendous bang for the buck at the portfolio level. So what we're talking about is that the Agile PMO needs to be looking at optimizing for throughput, not utilization. Throughput being the rate at which projects net money or are delivered into production for the business. The PMOs need to avoid being too focused on resource utilization. And as we'll see in a minute, that actually being too focused on resource utilization might actually slow down individual project delivery. PMOs need to limit work in process, allow lean. Inventory is bad. If you have a bunch of projects in a portfolio, individual projects don't get delivered to production really well or consistently or reliably. PMOs need to do that instead of limiting team freedom. Sometimes there's a complaint that PMOs squelch the innovation and creativity and freedom of teams. We don't want that at all. We want to preserve and enhance and sustain the hard-earned gains that we've gotten in the team employee satisfaction, associate satisfaction, and the way that people really like working on Agile teams. We don't want, we want to preserve that. We don't want the PMO to do anything other than sustain and empower and enhance that team freedom. Also, we want the PMO to move away from this, being perceived as a process police, as a process audit compliance, folks who come around and check, insist on checking 56 boxes or however many boxes and insisting on process compliance. Process compliance is good, but it has to be interpreted in the light of a delivery of value, or from lean, we use this term flow. Let's have a clean flow of value, and let our PMO members, our star project managers who are now on the PMO, let them obsess about the flow of value, not get too drawn down into the weeds of the process. Set some high-level guidelines and controls, and let the teams deliver within those sandboxes. Let's take a look at some practices. There are 4 practices that we'll be looking at, bringing some of this lean discipline to project prioritization and selection, tracking project portfolios, opening up the black box, if you will, of the project portfolio, figuring out where projects are they delivering value, are they having issues, removing some obstacles. We need to track project portfolios and figure out what the projects are doing within that portfolio. The other thing we need to make sure is that we have a good solution for resource management. As we know, most agile teams will demand that most team members are dedicated to the project. Our guideline is that you break your team into a core team and an extended team, and then the core team members are dedicated at least 80% of their time to that project. Now, that creates an issue sometimes because people are sometimes expected to perform on multiple projects. So we need some clear guidelines on how to manage resources or people, because some people find the term resource management offensive when it relates to people. We also need to find a way to sustain and scale our Agile adoption. We've done some great work. We've invested in Scrum. We've invested in XP. We need to find a way to empower those teams and leverage that investment in a very sort of hard-nosed financial way. So let's take a look at each of these in detail. First, let's start with project prioritization and selection. If you look at the typical project portfolio, and if anyone recognizes the city, you can help Leanne and myself. We're wondering whether it's Atlanta, but then we decided that the profile doesn't match exactly. So if anyone recognizes the city, do let us know. We'd appreciate that. But if you look at the highway over there, and this is an expensive public resource, taxpayer money has been pumped into this highway. And as taxpayers, we're probably looking at this highway and saying, wow, this highway is really wonderfully utilized. There's a lot of cars on the highway, and almost every square inch, as it were, is on the highway is utilized. What if we, as a driver in a car, are we feeling happy? More than likely not. We're not feeling happy about the utilization. We're feeling unhappy with the fact that we cannot get from our source to our destination. We can't get from start to destination in as fast a time as possible. Put another way, our throughput or our cycle time is not that good. So a typical project portfolio or a network or a CPU or any queue is generally governed by some queuing theory, and we can look at the graph over there and we see that as utilization increases, and definitely beyond about an 80% threshold, cycle time increases exponentially. So what this tells us in simple English is that if you have too many cars on the highway or too many projects in our portfolio, the delivery of individual projects is just going to be slowed down, just as the the pace of an individual car is slowed down. We also have problems with resource overutilization. There's a general trend that we think that the more we utilize our resources, the better value we'll get and the faster our projects will get delivered. Obviously, we can look at this and see that there's a threshold beyond which things just don't work really well. And so this loading up John and Sally and Sue and Venkat beyond an 80% threshold probably doesn't deliver value, and certainly in some aspects would hamper them from actually getting projects to completion. There's also variation in the portfolio. There are large batch sizes, which means they might be big projects. There's unregulated demand, which means our customers come to us and give us unforeseen projects, and we're not really prepared to deliver them. And there's an irregular rate of service, which means we're not able to service the projects as they come in any consistent fashion. So what can we do to address some of these problems? The first thing we need to do is to realign the portfolio. So we see over there on the right-hand side in the sidebar that little flaw that comes to us from Lean tells us that cycle time is directly proportional to work in process and inversely proportional to the average completion rate. In a portfolio management scenario, this means that the more work in process or the more in-flight projects we have, the larger will be the cycle time. So if we want to reduce cycle time, we have two levers. We either need to decrease work in process, reduce the number of projects, or we need to increase average completion rate. The completion rate is at which individual teams or groups can deliver is really kind of constrained. We can't go to our teams and throw a ton of people at them. Adding people is not a solution, as we know from the mythical man month and Fred Brooks. And there's a threshold beyond which it's really hard to increase. There's a ceiling by which it's really hard to increase completion rate. So really, the best way to get cycle time down is to reduce our work in process. How do we do that? First thing we need to do is to go after these sick projects, the undead projects, if you will, in our portfolio, and really find a discipline to terminate projects. And it seems like many of our organizations are really good at starting projects. Not many of us are really good at closing or shutting down projects. So when a project is really running into trouble and it's clear that it doesn't deliver value, we need to have an easy and a non-political way of terminating it and shutting it down, just so that we can free up some of the resources, free up some of the people and other resources and devote those to other higher priority projects. The other issue is with large projects, as we saw from the previous graph in the graph on the previous page. The larger the project, or the larger the batch size, if you will, the longer it takes. So if we want to increase throughput, we need to split our large projects into small ones. A nice and a decent way to do this is to limit our development time frame to months instead of years. We need to move away from multi-year projects, or at least make sure that any multi-year project is delivering to production in under a year. So if we have an overall life cycle where we start off with some business goals and strategy, and then we put a project in the backlog, we need to make sure that that backlog of projects. This is not a typical product backlog that we see on an individual from Scrum or XP. This is a backlog of all the projects coming up. It's a queue, if you will, and we need to make sure that these projects are prioritized and reprioritized regularly. And when they enter development, we need to enforce that they finish up, they at least release to production in under a year, preferably closer to 3 and 6 months, depending on the size of the project. In terms of identifying and selecting projects, we have to ask a few questions. We have to set in place, as members of a PMO, working with business customers who also should be members of the PMO, for example. We should ask the question, should we do this project at all? Does it make sense? Does it have a clear business case? We need to enforce some of the discipline. This is where some of the things, the background from the PMBOK and PMI can really help in making sure that we have a strong discipline and a clear-cut business case and a project charter before we start a project. The other thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we have some fairly objective ranking criteria that depoliticizes the prioritization of projects as much as possible. And then we need to get a group within the PMO working with business executives and some demand, whether you call them a demand council or a demand management group, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing the demand, specifically the projects that are being queued up and for delivery. You might have a project scoring criteria like that we have on the screen that lists things like alignment to strategy, cost customization, fits our technical architecture, and you might have some weightage to each of these individual parameters. And once we run our 5 projects through that filter, we might end up with something like you see at the bottom of slide 14, where we have project B that wins the race, if you will, and gets to be the first out of the gate onto the highway into our project portfolio with 100 points, and projects A, C, E, and D are next with 90, 80, and 70 points each, if you will. So this is just a sample evaluation criteria. If you look to portfolio management techniques, they're usually very good. They're very good selection criteria techniques that we can draw from those. And most organizations will have some fairly decent criteria for selection. They're just not used, and a lot of times they're not utilized by the PMO. And many times they're not applied to projects in any significant fashion. We want to change that. Before I move on to the tracking of the portfolio, I want to emphasize that this is not a one-time deal. Just as we go back and do release planning on our product portfolio, product backlog, we need to go back and do release planning on our project or our portfolio backlog and make sure that we're reprioritizing as business circumstances change and as demand changes. And typically, we see that this is done usually around in a yearly cycle, and at best a quarterly cycle. A quarterly cycle is pretty good, and if you have that, consider yourself fortunate. But it would be great if you can, if the members of the PMO can work with business members and other IT executives to make this a monthly prioritization exercise, and then draw on the benefits of the fact that Agile teams might be delivering into production, getting some of the early value out there, and thereby freeing up dollars to move to other projects and move into this notion of incremental funding. Real options theory that's been spoken about in the Agile industry also might apply over here. So there's some really good value to make sure that we have a monthly prioritization exercise. What do we do as far as tracking these projects? Well, there are some techniques that we use on the Agile projects that we can take and scale to a portfolio level, to a program level. Now, we've seen places where they'll have what we call a portfolio alignment wall. This is a list of all the work that's coming in at an epic or a higher level across different projects, managing the dependencies between those different projects, for example. And we've had teams that have been coordinating somewhere between 25, 30 projects using a technique like this, a tracking board on a wall. If you look at the columns, the columns are the sprints or the timeline. These are actually monthly timelines over there that you see. And then the features are laid out on index cards, and the rows actually track the feature streams across the different projects. There are different techniques to identify the dependencies between the different projects. And for example, the card colors might identify some Agile teams, other cards might identify non-Agile teams. A lot of times we find, in fact, mostly we find Agile projects will be delivering along with other non-Agile projects, waterfall projects, commercial off-the-shelf implementation. Agile teams don't exist in a vacuum, and we need to find a way to make sure that we can coordinate with the other teams that are delivering. So this is a neat technique where we can have a stand-up meeting. The PMO can meet with members of different teams and do kind of a scrum of scrums, but very focused, tracking to the board, this particular board, and also many of the leaders in the industry that are practicing these techniques ensure that they have a tool that tracks this, because it's just not on a portfolio wall, but it's also in an Agile project management, Agile lifecycle management tool, and that's available to executive management as well. Another way to track the portfolio is to use something called a cumulative flow diagram. Now, cumulative flow diagram is going to measure things like the inventory of our projects, the backlog, if you will, what's in the queue. What are some of the projects that have been started? What are now in design? What are being coded? What are being coded? And what are complete? And what we want in this cumulative flow is we want to see a continuous flow, if you will, I'm sorry, it's not cumulative flow. I'm sorry, it's a continuous flow diagram. We want to make sure that we have a continuous flow of features from start to finish, as they start off from inventory and as they move on to be complete. So there are some trends that we can look for. If we have a ragged flow or long cycle time starting to completed, we can identify it pretty easily from here. We want a smooth flow, and we can look at the bands over there. The edges of those bands should be smooth and without any jags, if you will. And then that's the kind of trend and the pattern that we're looking for. Okay. The other thing that we need to talk about is resource management. So we'll talk a little bit about resource management, and we'll wrap up with sustainable agile adoption in a second. Resource management is a sticky one. If we look at traditional resource management, first of all, a lot of people in the Agile community would probably object to being called resources. People have strong feelings on this, and they say, well, people are not resources. But that discussion aside, when the way we organize our teams and the way we manage our resources, including people, is not very smart. If you're taking a throughput view rather than a utilization view, what does that mean? Well, the typical scenario looks like this. We have a number of projects underway concurrently. We have people split between those multiple projects, and industry studies will show that the typical team member is working on anywhere between 3 to 5 projects. And why is this happening? Well, this is happening because our resource managers and our other managers are stressing maximum resource utilization. What do we mean? Well, if we see a team member, Joe has a few spare cycles here. Let's load him up. He has 10% free. Well, let's use that 10% on another project. And if Sally has another 20% that's coming up, she's working 80% on one project. She has another 20% available. Let's use that 20% on another project. And the thinking is that if we get our resources to 100% utilization, our projects will go faster. As we saw, what ends up happening is that we only end up clogging the project, the portfolio pipeline, if you will, or the portfolio highway, if you want to remember the highway metaphor. And also, if you're doing waterfall, the return on investment is only available after the projects are done. So what's the alternative? Actually, we can. Before we jump to the alternative, let's look at this task, this picture over here about the number of assigned tasks and what happens when we switch people between on a number of tasks or between projects. It turns out that if people are working on one thing and then we move to at least 2 tasks, or maybe you can think of this as the people working on a couple projects, productivity goes up. After that, though, if we increase the number of tasks or number of projects that people are working on, 3, 4, 5, we can see that productivity goes down. So the way to deal with this is to move towards a stable teams model. And as I mentioned, there are some members in the industry who are using this successfully. They might call it stable teams or standing teams or platform teams, all the same idea where we have integrated teams. If you look towards the top of the diagram on the right, we have our integrated Agile teams, and those Agile teams have core members who are dedicated to those projects 80% of the time. And then if you move sort of downwards, the Agile teams are only working on one active project at a time. What do they do when they're finished with that project? They take the next queued project and they work on that. And this pipeline of project is queued up by team, by each stable team, and a team is then able to work on just one project at a time without interruption and really focus on throughput and not maximum utilization. Now, what are some of the underlying things that have to be dealt with? As we saw, we need to make sure that the project backlog is prioritized and the projects are queued up, and we bring the projects through to the teams. So this is a mind shift. Rather than bringing people to projects, we bring projects to teams. A different mind shift, and takes a lot of doing, but is, as you can see, at least theoretically, it's fairly straightforward. Now, I understand politically and in practice, it might take a little bit of doing, but there are definitely several industry members who have been doing Agile for a while and who are starting to move to this, or have already moved to this model. Okay. In lean organizations, what we're seeing is that we want to dedicate the core process to each project team. It's solve. And then what we end up with the stable teams model is that we find that we have return on investment in the aggregate that is delivered more through staged releases and ends up being much more than just a single release at the end. And we get this by stressing our maximum project throughput and not the utilization. Okay. How do we, when we need to scale our Agile teams and really move from one or two to more Agile teams, there's some thinking that's important to keep in mind. There's a wonderful book called Small is Beautiful that I draw a lot of inspiration from. It comes from the 1970s. And in that Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, who's the author of the book, talks about how large organizations can really deliver value. And what he says is that for a large organization to work properly or to just to work in general, it must behave like a related group of small organizations. So, and what does this mean to us when we're scaling Agile teams? We need to say that we conquer and divide. We don't take a divide and conquer top-down, industrial management approach. But we start small with one team. We conquer a project at a time, and then add a bunch of small integrated teams. So some guidelines. I actually talk about this in my book, Managing Agile Projects. But there's some guidelines about building the whole into the parts. This is around preserving the DNA of the team, if you will, making sure that we're just not starting a fresh team, but we're seeding the team with a few key members to make sure they're set up for success. There's a size limit that comes from Scrum, 7 plus or minus 2. And then we grow these teams till the size limit is reached. And when that limit is reached, we start a new team. Now, these teams just can't go off and operate completely independently and separately. And that's where the role of the PMO comes in, that we coordinate at a higher level using an Agile PMO. Okay. Brings us to the last topic in today's seminar, and that's around some thoughts around sustaining Agile adoption. So we've talked about why we need an Agile PMO. We talked about setting up the Agile PMO and looking at in some ways to do adaptive governance through project prioritization and scaling, tracking the portfolio, managing resources, and finally, Agile adoption. There are a couple of points I want to cover, nothing extensive here, because each organization is different, but the successful corporate adoptions of Agile, by corporate I mean organizational level, beyond a single project, multiple projects, department-wide or sometimes enterprise-wide adoptions of Agile are successful and are able to really carry the success of the individual team forward when they follow a clear education and coaching path. This means that when we put members on Agile teams, whether they are developers, Scrum Masters, product owners, what have you, or managers and executives, we need to make sure that they have the education and training so that they can succeed in their new roles. And without these, we've seen many in Agile adoption fail. So what are some of the ways to do this? We can have one-on-one sessions with managers and executives who tend to be hard-pressed for time and may not be available to pull out for like a couple of days of training. We need to make sure that there's a training curriculum. Building this competency, building an Agile capability requires some standard curriculum so that we can make sure that people are trained and have that common definition, common jargon, common taxonomy, whatever you want to call it, but basically this common language and common understanding of what Agile means. We need to create an Agile career path. So it's not just enough to send people to Scrum training or have it. Certainly that's a very good entry level thing to do. But after that, what do people do once they become Scrum Masters or once they become Agile developers? What's their career path? How can they move up the chain? People are looking for career advancement, and we need to make sure that that's available in the Agile team as well. We need to make sure that the Agile, the members of the Agile PMO function more as coaches. So they, are project managers or Scrum Masters in the PMO, or other technical leads or senior members can now function as coaches and really support and empower members of the team. As the new team spins up, folks from the PMO might show up and do a training session, help them with their discovery, organize their sprints, help them with their burn-down charts, and really lay the foundation for that team so that it can be successful. On an ongoing basis, we need to make sure that teams have project team coaching and mentoring. Agile is not an easy thing to to succeed at it. Scrum and Agile principles are fairly simple in theory, but they're hard in practice. And teams need ongoing support beyond a few initial training days as they encounter organizational change problems, as they encounter organizational dysfunction sometimes, to deal with that and figure out how to adapt the textbook Agile context in their particular circumstances. And then also, very importantly, we need to make sure that team members have training and coaching on Agile engineering. These are the XP practices. We know that successful Scrum implementations can rise to another level when they're combined with Agile engineering and practices from XP, extreme programming or XP, simple design, refactoring, test-driven development, the continuous integration. These are all wonderful practices and are really necessary as a technical discipline, and they are necessary to build that robust infrastructure for automated builds and automated testing that enables the fast movement and high quality that you get on an Agile team. And then finally, our thought of it is we need to give some thought to process standardization. Now, this might be a no-no. This might be, I know teams will generally react somewhat negatively to the idea of a standardized process. Now, there some warning signs might be if you're trying to standardize story points across teams. You don't want to do that, right? We know that things like story points are germane to each team or are particular to each team and should not be looked at as a standard measure or a standard metric across different teams. But there are other things that can be standardized. We can standardize high-level process steps. We can put some deliverable templates. We can make sure that we have a tool, a standard tool in which to capture our metrics, our user stories, and people are trained in that tool and can get it up and running very quickly. We need to agree that on process audit measures, no process, no organization exists in a vacuum, and there's usually some regulatory oversight. So what are some ways by which an Agile project can be audited? How can we work with internal and external auditors? And how can we make sure that the process at the enterprise supports an audit and doesn't get us into trouble? These are all things with which a PMO can play a wonderful supportive role. And then again, another contentious topic is the idea of standard process metrics. If you have heard of any of the things that Mary Poppendich has done some really wonderful work in this area, and she'll talk about things like measuring up. Just measure a few things. Don't measure at the detail level. We need to get to a couple of detail metrics. My colleague Roland Coyar and myself have done some work in this area. You can check our blog or check out the previous version 1 webinars. We've done some talking and some presentations on this in this area. But you want to decide on a couple of metrics like cycle time or some outcome-focused metrics, perhaps like NPV, net present value, that really help us understand the value that these Agile projects are delivering and help to make the case for Agile at the enterprise level, but also ensure that Agile teams are linked in and continue to deliver value using the Agile process. And the Agile process is just not an end in itself, but it's a means towards delivering business value. And with that, I want to close and open it up for questions. We have if you need to contact me. Oops, I'm going to skip through these slides a little quickly so I can get back to the contact slide. But there's contact information for myself. You can reach me at sanjeev.augustine@lightspeed.com. And if you need further information about some of the things that I've talked about, you can go to our website, lightspeed.com, or to my personal website, sanjeev.augustine.com. We have a blog. We have resources section, tons of things, and lots of material available with that. With that, I'll turn it back to Leanne. And Leanne, if you want to, should we open up for questions?
Absolutely, and thank you so much. Excellent presentation. The first question that we have is, how do you deal with projects that have dependencies across teams?
I'm sorry, how do you deal with projects that have dependencies across
teams?
Okay, I'm actually going to flip back to the slide on tracking the portfolio or tracking the projects within the portfolio. What we see here is a very practical example of a project tracking or a dependency tracking mechanism across multiple teams. As I mentioned, this particular one has been used to track about 30 plus teams. So it scales pretty reasonably. And of course, if you have more than 200 projects, then it might be a little tough. But then you can just use the same system and put it in a tool. But here's a technique that's been used out in the industry very successfully, where you have multiple teams and the dependencies between those teams identified. We have a timeline, a month-by-month timeline on these are the columns, and the features, the feature stream are the rows, and the groups of those features are what are being delivered in individual projects. And then we just define or identify the dependencies between those teams, and you see the labels on these individual cards. This is a system that was put together by Bob Payne, a colleague of mine, amazing thinker in this, and he essentially took a very straightforward Agile technique, and this has been used out in the industry very successfully to track dependencies between these teams. Now, you can also track dependencies between teams using an enterprise tool like version 1 and track the higher level epics, and just so that you have an electronic system of record for the stuff that's up on the wall, for example.
Very good. Next question is, what percentage of Agile organizations have an Agile PMO?
Leanna, I'll leave that one for you to ask in the next State of Agile survey. I don't know.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know that I know that I've seen at least 4 or 5 organizations with Agile PMO, and that's in the last year.
Okay. So a little bit of a follow-up to that is, how well received from Agile thought leaders is the idea of an Agile PMO?
I'm sorry?
How well received from Agile thought leaders is the idea of an Agile PMO?
Well, I can point to a couple. If you read Scaling Lean and Agile Development by Craig Larman and Bas Bode, they will advise you not to put up an Agile PMO. So that's one instance where I would say there's a contrary system of some thinking contrary to my own. But I've seen it work in industry, and I'm not completely sure what others in the industry are talking, but I haven't received a lot of resistance when we lay out the thinking and the practices and principles that we've done over here. I think what people are opposed to is this perception of a PMO as a heavy-handed organization, and they're scared, if you will, that they don't want to repeat that kind of any baggage that they're coming with in terms of having a PMO coming down with a heavy hand on an Agile team. So, but given the techniques we've laid down over here, we've not had a problem with that.
I know Michelle Sliger is also a proponent of an Agile PMO.
That's right. Michelle Sliger, Stacia Broderick, they're definitely strong proponents of Agile PMOs. And Jean Tabeka as well, I believe.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, do you have a recommendation on an Agile tool that can operate at the portfolio level?
So I believe the enterprise tools like version 1 and perhaps Rally would support some of the functionality. I am not sure how well the traditional portfolio management tools support the things that we've been talking about. But in terms of what I've described so far, these particular techniques and practices are supported in the current Agile tool.
All right. Oh, and we did find out that the city that is on the slide with the highway is Atlanta.
Just as we suspected.
It is. So again, we encourage people to ask questions throughout. So we've got another question that just came in. It says, our organization is very interested in defect density. Do you have any recommendations on how this can be done in Agile?
On what density?
Defects.
Defect. How many defects? So that's probably doesn't relate directly to the PMO itself, but I would say if you're really interested in figuring out how to track defect density, one of the teams that we work with tracked first pass test rate. This is the rate at which the defects are discovered in system testing, so integration testing, system testing, and teams moved from waterfall to Agile, for example, there's one team that was able to move from a 45% first pass test rate to an over 90% first pass test rate using Agile. So that's one metric that's pretty decent, using a first pass test rate, and you can apply it pretty equally between waterfall and Agile, and make sure that your Agile teams are delivering better quality, less defect or defect-free code.
We have a request if you could go back to your slide on continuous flow.
Okay.
And then we also had a question around what is the best technique for estimating team velocity in a new Agile team?
So estimating, are those two separate questions?
Yeah. So one person had just requested that you go back to the continuous flow slide, and then another question was about the velocity.
Okay, so the slides will be available on the website just in case you want to go back and refer to them. Is that correct, Leanne?
Yes, and people can request the presentation as well.
Okay, fantastic. And then the second question was around estimating velocity. Is that correct?
For a new team, yes.
For a new team. So Mike Cohn has COHN has done some fantastic work in this area. He's got a wonderful book on Agile estimating and planning, and he will lay out in detail techniques by which a new team can get up and running doing estimation. I do cover it a little bit in my book and Managing Agile Projects, but if you're looking for guidance, I would definitely point you towards Mike Cohn. And the answer is that there's no clear way to initially get some very good estimates. Teams have to find their ways, find their way around first, get a little, at least a few sprints under their belts before they can get to really accurate estimates. But one thing I like to point out over here is that when we're delivering with Agile, when we're practicing Agile methods, don't forget the power of the actual system itself. If you're doing Agile right, you should have, or Scrum right, at the end of every sprint or iteration, you should have production ready code. And at the end of every release, you should be releasing the production. What this means is that you now have the system itself as a demonstration or a clear metric that you can show to your stakeholders and say, here's what we've done. We can look back and we can demonstrate incremental progress with the code itself at the end of every sprint, or with the working system at the end of every sprint. We did not have that with waterfall, and therefore we probably needed some sophisticated estimation techniques. If I finish my requirements document, am I 20% done or am I 30% done? If I finish my design phase, am I 40% done or am I 50% done? In reality, we no longer have to play that guessing game, and our estimation techniques become more focused around what is the capacity of the team, how much can they deliver from sprint to sprint, and as long as they're delivering production-ready code and a product increment at the end of every sprint, that's the best measure of progress.
Very good. It was also requested that since you are now on the continuous flow slide, if you could provide some additional details.
Sure. If you look at the way this is laid out, basically you start off with your feature inventory, if you will. This is the purple area, and you want to burn down or reduce that, make sure that area is complete. Those features move from that inventory to complete. And every project is different, but this particular project has, maybe we're just tracking it by features that have been started, that have been designed, and that have been coded, and after that maybe unit tested and acceptance tested, and this is completed. So we want to make sure that features are moving as quickly as possible from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. What this means is that the purple area has to shrink and the maroon area has to grow as much as possible or as quickly as possible. The flow aspect of it means that these features have to flow from stage to stage of the process as evenly as possible. So if you see a ragged swath or a ragged pattern to the different colored bands over there, that means that you have some jumps between the process, and that points to obstacles within each process stage. So put another way, it means your features are not flowing evenly or seamlessly from stage to stage. Something might be getting started, but it's getting stuck in design, and that's why there's a jagged edge over there. It's plateauing out. It may be getting designed, but it's not getting coded. And as a portfolio manager, or even as a scrum master on individual projects, because you can do this at the project level as well. But as a portfolio manager, you want to look at the features, maybe a group of what we call minimum marketable features, or MMF set on a project, and you want to make sure that on these different projects, features are flowing from start to finish as evenly as possible.
Thank you for that. There's also been a request if you could bring up your contact information slide again.
Sure.
And with that, we're pretty much at a point we need to be wrapping up. So I wanted to thank you again for your time today, and thank Sanjeev for an excellent presentation. And I'll turn it over to you for parting words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Leanne. I appreciate the opportunity to present over here at this webinar. Again, if you want to reach me, you can reach me at any of these websites, or shoot me an email. I also have a fairly busy travel schedule, so coming soon to a city near you might be a certified Scrum Master class by me. So do check out our training schedule as well. And either myself or my colleagues, Arlen Bankston and Roland Coyar and David Balkin, are available to answer any questions and help